Welcome back to African Voices. I'm Bailo Jallo, and it's my colleague, Dr. Kululeku Sibanda, an African analyst in politics. Earlier on, we were discussing about Sierra Leone. We were discussing the upcoming runoff between Julius Maada Bio and Dr. Samura Kamara of the APC. So in terms of moving on, the runoff is in a week time on the 27th of May, which the first round has been praised by international observers, by the African Union, that it was violence-free, even though there were some minor problems in the country, which NEC and the government have been appealing to people to vote calmly and to avoid any trouble. So what's your take on the runoff? What do you think is going to happen? And do you think everything is going to be smooth as it was on the first round?
Well, the big concern is that there are already reports of violence in the country as the country prepares for a runoff, and that this is endemic. And I do not understand why anybody would believe that in this century violence still works in terms of delivering elections. Maybe perhaps because there is a very large rural community in Sierra Leone, as is the case in many third world countries, and that politicians believe that these people may feel targeted, and that because they feel targeted, they're going to vote in particular, and they feel certainly very visible, perhaps even think that their votes can somehow be known. That therefore, as a result of that, violence still works. But the African Union has issued a statement condemning instances of violence as at its annual meeting in Rwanda. I think that is positive, but I think that the African Union should certainly move beyond simply making statements. They must take very strong and stringent measures against political countries that are members of the Union that practice violence, a dehumanizing activity against fellow human beings, and must, if possible, send additional monitors, send non-violence practitioners into the country. No matter how small scale the violence should be, Africa must move towards a point where we respect the people's right to vote, and to do so without being forced, and to do so as they please, because the idea of a democracy is not that somebody should take over power. It's not that somebody should feel entitled. Those who practice violence feel entitled to power, and therefore that if you don't give them power, you're making a mistake and you should be punished for it. I think that should be a huge focus. And these people who practice violence during elections have three things that they manage to do when they get into power. They manage to become very corrupt, because already they've gotten into power through election. So the things that we're talking about earlier, such as aid money getting into the country and not reaching its intended recipients, are always going to be possible where people owe their power to somebody else. If people are carrying out violent activities for an individual, for a politician to get elected, the politician owes everything they have at that moment, their power, to those people, and they'll be corrupt to appease those individuals. So we should be violence intolerant. We should be a violent-free people in terms of elections. And anybody who gets into election with instances of violence that they didn't deal with very stringently. And I don't think that violence should be dealt with by the state per se. I think violence should be dealt with by political parties themselves. And a political party that practices violence must be referred to an international organization, to African Union, for example, or ECOWAS in this case, to see if they will be reprimanded very heavily. And that when they take their seat in those organizations, they're given string measures. I am inclined to make very strong arguments against the use of violence in elections, and I think that that's the beginning of all the bad that we see. Hopefully,
all the Sierra Leoneans in that country, and we hope and pray that the election or the runoff goes well, and they will hear what you've just said, so that it's going to be a smooth and violence-free election, as I am hoping, because it is a country that's very dear to me, and I'm praying that this time we will be popular, not for the negative reasons, but hopefully for the positive reasons.
Look, Bella, I was excited beyond imagination, just for the fact that we thought, and that the reports coming out of Sierra Leone were that the country had instituted a technological voting which would ensure and guarantee the integrity of elections as a process rather than an event to get somebody into office. And we're being taken aback now when we hear that that wasn't the case. But even then, we're being taken far much back if instances of violence continue to be part of the electoral process in any country in Africa, but more so in a country that we thought was seriously instituting a new idea about voting, an idea that would put it squarely in the 21st century as a population and a people that is willing to take the idea of state, the idea of country, the idea of democracy to its next level. We're still far behind in terms of the idea of democracy. A lot of Africans believe, and it's unfortunate, a lot of Africans who are voting today, who are going to be voting throughout the continent, and even Africans who are living in the diaspora in countries like the United Kingdom, still believe very wrongly and strongly that elections are about power. They believe that politics is about power acquisition. The fact of the matter is this: elections aren't about power acquisition. Elections are just about 10% of the whole idea of democracy. Elections contribute in that process of making sure that there are custodians of the state for a particular period of time. But in reality, the whole idea is democracy, where elections should be just part of it. And after that, you have continued dialogue between politicians and the electorate. You have a discussion of policies between the elected people and the electors. You have that in this country. Sheffield City Council here will from time to time send you proposals to make comments on, to come into City Hall and make contributions about a simple policy, because that is politics. Politics goes beyond that. You hear this in Africa a lot. I support my candidate
but one thing you need to remember, I'm not cutting you off, democracy has been in this country for more than 100, 200 years. Democracy is just starting to grow up in Africa. We've just started it. What we used to have traditionally, we left that and we took the Western democracy, which we said that was the real one. So now with that Western democracy that we've taken, we're not there yet. It's a process, I believe.
You're right, my brother. But here's the thing: if you're gonna make a bike and somebody else has already made it, it will be folly for you to start by trying to remake the wheel. The wheel is already there. If you're making your bike, you perfect it. We have examples of democracy, and that we should emulate, that we should improve. And what we're doing in Africa is we are cutting the idea of democracy into its bare bones. We take elections to be equal to democracy. No. You can have free and fair elections in a country and not have democracy. Let alone unfree and unfair elections. You will not have democracy. You can't achieve democracy that way. Elections are not the same thing as democracy. Democracy is a process that lives from the day of this election to the date of the next election. The whole process in the middle, how politicians relate with the electorate, how policies are made a part of democracy, how people are registered to vote, how people go to the polling station. All those activities are part of the elections. The African makes this terrible mistake that elections are about the day of about the person who gets elected. I hear this argument, Bela, now happening all across Africa, that the person who has the right to speak to people is the one who can sort of run the system and get as many votes as possible. It doesn't matter how they run the system. It's about the numbers. It's about numbers. You hear this a lot. Politics isn't about numbers. It is about numbers. It is people who are untrained and unaware and have an illusion of what politics is, who think that politics is about numbers. Politics is about the majority and the minority.
Okay.
Democracy is about those who win and those who lose. Politics is not about those who win today and lose tomorrow. It is about all of us. We use politics to build the best possible environment, best possible life for the largest, if not all, the number of people. It is not about the person who gets the largest votes. Hitler, I'll give you an example, got the largest votes. He didn't give the world any democracy. He gave us the Second World War. He gave us more than 6 million dead bodies. He gave us more than 34 million dead bodies. He gave us the Second World War. Now, Africans need to begin to realize that the faster we run away from the idea that all of politics is about the person with the largest votes or the person with the loudest crowd is incomplete, and that idea has to be developed further. And it is people who have not started politics, people who have not understood politics, who keep telling us every day that the most successful politician is the one who gets the largest support. No. The most successful politician is the one who develops his country, his or her country, who develops his community, our people, his or her community. That is the kind of politician we want.
Okay. Well, talking of the democracy and the violence, well, if we can just stop there for Sierra Leone, because as we stated in our opening, that we were going to discuss Guinea and Kenya as well. So if I can just move on to Guinea-Conakry, which for the past couple of weeks as well, there has been violence in the country, opposition leaders calling for protests and protesters getting out in their numbers, and activists or protesters getting shot. Just before we came on air, I had reports that someone was shot today again, a lady, because there was a protest in the country. And for the past couple of weeks, teachers have been on strike and kids were not going to school. But fortunately, that has been resolved now. But just in a few weeks back, I would say about a month back, there were local elections in Guinea as well, which the election was held before the one even in Sierra Leone. But up to now, a clear result has not been out. The opposition has played foul. So since then, the National Electoral Commission has not announced the result. So the democracy that you're talking about, where or what kind of democracy is that? Because someone claiming foul, which according to the government, they won, opposition leaders as well are saying they won, but there is no clear indication of who have won. And since then, there has been protest. So where do you think people need to go? Who do you think people need to be listening to? Because each and everyone is just saying they are the one that are right, this person is wrong. And the NEC or the National Electoral Commission is not coming out right and clear to say this is this, and it's been more than 4 or 5 weeks and no results.
Exactly. Isn't this the problem that we were diagnosing earlier on, that the African political landscape is run by people who are interested only in winning, who are interested only in coming out at the other end with the power, and that it doesn't matter in the middle. And that Professor Lumumba will blame the politician who wants to win and stop there. And I think he needs to go further than that. He needs to look at whether or not the electorate themselves, the voters themselves, are doing the right thing. You have politicians that are corrupt before they go into office. People will tell you that there are instances of corruption that have been leveled against them and have not been resolved at all, and that politician gets voted into office, and then the electors expect something different thereafter. The population expects something different after that, and that when corruption and development never takes place, we begin to blame them. Look, we're very clear now that the elections were held way back in February, and the results have not been announced. This happened in Zimbabwe 2008, where an election was held, and 3 weeks into it, after that, the results weren't announced. And when they were announced, of course, the opposition had lost. And you're asking yourself, honestly, why would it take so long to count and bring out the results? And this is where your African Union, this is where your local, your regional organizations and international organizations must come in very clearly and say, this is not acceptable. I think that with the situation now, the local elections...
But that regional organization that you're talking of, sorry to interrupt, what about if they are all birds of the same feather? SADC, ECOWAS, the African Union. These are all leaders. I'm not saying all of them, but there are leaders in there who have been there for 20, 30 years, and they are still there. So what can you come and preach to me who has been there for just 5, 10 years when you've been there for 10, 30, 20 years?
Agreed, but you know, there's a generation of young people that that is likely to come through, and that this internet generation, or the millennials, if you want to talk of it that way, that is coming up, must now be voting not for individuals. And my heart sinks when every time I see these young people being drawn into the politics of individuals, not the idea of democracy, where they're supporting individuals. We are not going to stop. We are not going to deal with the problem of a large club of powerful men who want to cheat elections every other 4 or 5 years, until the young people have gone back to their villages, told their mothers, their fathers, their uncles, and their brothers that no longer in Africa shall an election be about Robert Mugabe. No longer in Africa shall an election, thank God for Mandela, but there must never be an election that's about Mandela. It must be about the ideas that Mandela has and how he wishes to achieve those results. And it must not be about loudmouth Robert Mugabe saying anything he can about any Western country and not looking as though he is an anti-imperialist and therefore he should be voted all the time until the military kicks him out. It should never be about that. No longer in this century shall Africa be run on those ideas. We shall catch up with the rest of the world and start voting for people because they're talking about a national health service, because they're talking about a national educational program, because they're talking about disaster relief that's meaningful, because they're talking about an Africa that's moving away from a primary economy to a secondary and tertiary economy. We must be beginning to talk about that. And if our young people do not take this mantra, do not take this responsibility to teach themselves and to teach their communities that the world doesn't move because one man breeds. The world doesn't move because one man has a large convoy of soldiers that are protecting him from his own people. The world moves because of ideas. We became, the world that we live in today became a better world. We developed a lot. When people somewhere in the world began to stop fearing the unknown and try to study and understand the unknown, people have studied the cold and discovered fire. People studied darkness and discovered electricity. People have studied everything. We need to begin to study our societies and our communities and understand that our biggest problem is our faith. We have too much faith in individuals. We have too much faith in powerful people. There is no one on earth who's more powerful than me and you. Okay.
So how do you feel to see someone like politicians sometimes who, when they are in the opposition, they preach foul or they preach for everyone to come together, vote for me and that kind of thing. And they preach all sorts of human rights, talk of good governance and that kind of thing. But then as soon as they come to power, they forget all what they were preaching when they were opposition leaders, or they forget about all what was happening to them, all the suffering, the kind of beatings that they used to get, or they are activists. Then they come into power and start doing the same.
Look, we have a good example in Africa, Tanzania, where you have this guy who's come in, Magufuli, and said, look, it's hard. Look, when a politician gets into office, the two things that they face, and these are contradictory. You go into office with all these promises, and then you realize, lo and behold, that actually, it's not an easy job. You cannot send every child to school. You cannot provide good health for everybody. You will not be able to build that railway line you promised. The teachers will not get the salary they want. It's not possible. It's difficult. It's an African country. GDPs are very low. Domestic product per capita is very low as well. So that's going to be hard. Then you're faced with the second problem. There is enough for you to steal. And then,
which is the big sickness in Africa.
It's a big sickness, and it's easy. If you're the president in Africa, it's easy to steal, it's easy to be corrupt. And what do? They fall onto the easy choice. They pick up the easy choice and go with it. You look at Magufuli right now, a lot of people will say all they want to say about him, but he will take 300, even if it's 300,000, and buy 2 beds for one hospital. That's what you need to move forward. But he needs to be pushing ideas around democracy, because while he's doing that, the opposition will oppose him.
Okay.
And he may feel, oh no, they are opposing me. Maybe I have the opportunity to take a hard stance, then he takes a hard stance.
Okay.
That doesn't work. What we need to do is to make these politicians and our young people understand, the young people more importantly, understand that we need a transition that moves us towards a Mungufulian world, a Mungufulian Africa, where even if it's a small thing, it gets done. Even if it's small transition, even if it's a small change, it needs to be done. Look what's happening in Guinea. You have children not going to school. You know what? The president still has a motorcade. The president still has an ambulance running with his blood following him everywhere. He could, if it is about educating the next generation of Guineans, I would say that president needs to take the risk to die than to have school children, to have young people go for 3 weeks without an education. There is nothing that's worth that. There is nothing that's worth a whole generation of young people that's not educated. And these people do not know what is more important to Africa than anything else.
Okay.
Africa survives today, my friend, because it has educated a few young people who have gone to the rest of the world and are busy repatriating money to Africa. And that's the most important thing.
Well, just to finalize, we've got less than 2 minutes. As you and I know, there has been a deal as well in Kenya. We promised earlier that we were going to discuss Kenya. We've seen those two arch rivals between the opposition leader, Raila Odinga, and also and Uhuru Kenyatta, the current president, whereas Kenya as well is another example where there is always violence after election. There are always a number of people being killed. So what's your take on the deal where they have promised now working together?
I think that working together is a great thing to begin to stop this violence, but I think that they need to move forward beyond just talking about a deal between themselves. I hear them talking a lot about the leaders, and very pathetic. These two people are calling themselves the leaders. They pull the country apart. What these two people must be talking about, they must begin now to talk about the example they want to set for democracy and for young people in that country to make sure that sectarian violence, tribal violence isn't part and parcel of the electoral process. That what it should be about is the idea of democracy and making Kenya proud about moving forward into the future.
Okay, we'll stop there. Thank you for watching. Unfortunately, that's all the time we've got for tonight. From me and the rest of the team here, until next week, you have a good night.